Hey Wargamers, welcome back to the channel, Death from Above Wargaming. I'm Aaron, and I'm back today with another mech review. So, last time we looked at the Zeus. You guys gave me a ton of awesome feedback. And so what I did was I spent the last few weeks digging into the model, revising the math, adding some new features, and I'm back with Battlytics 2.0. So thanks to all of you guys for your comments. Especially Lego, Mech, Cam, and Saniac. You guys gave me a lot of really in-depth feedback, and so I did my best to try to bake all of that into the new engine. So a couple of the big changes. First of all, we're strictly going to be looking at rules as written. So we removed extreme range, which is an optional rule. We took that out. We were also using just the stock modifiers, so +0 for short, +2 for medium, +4 for long. So that's basically what all of the average calculations are based on. Another big thing is you guys mentioned gunnery. And so I actually, I kept our base model at a gunnery 2, but I did an additional analysis around gunnery sensitivity. So this kind of shows us where some mechs really benefit from paying the premium for gunnery 0, where, you know, maybe it's just okay to run gunnery 3 or 4 or something along those lines, right? So where do you get the biggest return on investment for your BV there? Another thing that we added was the abstraction of sort of range and turn. So this was something that Insaniac mentioned. You know, tried a few different ways to do this, and really I baked this into the threat analysis. This is where it made the most sense. So looking at, you know, every range increment from 24 inches being the max range for an AC2 all the way down to 1 inch. What's your alpha strike capability? What's your average damage at that range? And what's sort of the threat ratio, or sort of a combination of when we're looking at how much damage you can do versus how much damage you're likely to do versus how much heat are you actually generating, right? Because that's the currency for damage. So looking at all that stuff, and I'll explain it when we go through, it's pretty cool. And there's a few other things as well. We looked at a lethality index. So some of you guys had mentioned, you know, how do we compare like an AC-20 or a Gauss rifle, right? Those single kill weapons versus just a smattering of, you know, LRMs or medium lasers. And it was a great point. So I built another simulation that takes the mech basically through, you know, the prescribed series of range brackets, and it's firing at a target. You know, how quickly does it kill the target? What's the average time to kill? What's the average damage per hit? So we look at some of those metrics to give us an idea of how lethal the mech is. So again, here we are, Battlytics 2.0. Thanks so much for your feedback. And what we're going to look at today is the Whitworth. So last week in our battle report, the Whitworth was a superstar. Really laid down some pain on poor Kevin's Capellans. But by the way, if you haven't seen that battle report, definitely check it out. It was pretty fun. So we're going to look at the Whitworth today. I think one of you guys may have suggested that in the comments that we take a look at it. So here we are. We're going to dive into the Whitworth now. So stay tuned. Don't go away. Whitworth mech review coming right up. All right, welcome back. Let's get this thing started. So the Whitworth, this is a 40-ton mech, medium inner sphere mech. Battle value is 982. That's just base battle value. So a little fluff about the mech. Mech was built in 2610. So that is like the early sort of Star League era, and the mech was around all the way through the late Succession Wars and beyond. Was refitted with you know, some of the new tech they found in the Helm Memory Core. So the Whitworth is a staple of BattleTech lore. It almost disappeared. I think there were only a few hundred left by the end of the early Succession Wars, but then in 3035 somebody built a spare parts plant, and so they started refitting these things and churning these things out. Pretty cool. But Whitworth, again, love this mech. I think it's a great bang for buck. You know, a solid performer, I should say. But let's dive into some of the core statistics. So movement-wise, this mech is a 4.6.4, so can jump, which is useful. Only has 10 heat sinks, so no extra heat sinks there, just your base. On the component side, everything's standard, right? We're in the Succession Wars era with this mech. So nothing fancy there, just standard armor, standard engine, so on and so forth. Speaking of armor, this mech, this is what makes this mech one of my favorites. This mech is packed 93.4% total armor coverage. So that's an armor factor of 128, 8 tons of armor, right? Just standard armor. but that's got really good coverage. So when you look at the little armor diagram there in the center, you can see it's pretty much maxed out just about everywhere. The mech has no hand actuators. Each arm packs a medium laser. It has a third medium laser mounted in the head, but its primary weapons are 2 LRM-10 launchers in each of the side torsos. And these things really can mess up some mechs of its size. And you know, obviously, big fan of long-range weapons. These things are great. They are each backed by 1 ton of ammo, so you're going to get 12 turns of sustained fire with these LRM-10s, which is pretty good. All right, so let's move on to the offensive side. So there's some new stuff here on this offensive benchmarking screen. We've revamped this a little bit, again, based on your guys' feedback. So what you'll notice here is there are basically 2 offensive benchmarks here on the left-hand side of your screen. So the first one is a combination of our baseline and our red line, which is where we're basically trying to build up as much heat as possible. And the second one is our optimized damage output. And again, you know, looking at the comparison overlaid with the baseline. So let's talk about the sort of the simulation here. So what happens is the Whitworth moves from range bracket, you know, from turn to turn, right? So turn 1 at 21 inches, turn 2 at 18, all the way to turn 12 at 1 inch, right? So you can see that on the x-axis. And what this Battlytics engine does is it looks at the available weapons and it looks at the heat threshold that you program in, and it optimizes. It says, all right, I can fire these weapons, I get the most damage for this heat. And so the baseline, the assumption is I'm not going to exceed 4 points of heat. So show me how much damage I can do without exceeding 4 points of heat. That's your white area. So as you can see, you know, there's a little spike at 7 inches when those LRMs hit the short range bracket. Kind of dips off a little bit, and then it kind of picks up as those medium lasers come into play at shorter range. The red line scenario basically says try to build up 29 points of heat as quickly as possible, but do not exceed 29 points of heat. We don't want to automatically shut down. We just want to see basically how hot we can get and how quickly we can get that hot. So you can see there is a heat build trend line. And right around 9 inches, that starts to spike up. And that's when those trio of medium lasers come into play. This thing's basically firing and building up almost 9 points of heat a turn, and it gets up there pretty quickly. So by turn, what is that, turn 10 basically, it's at max heat. It's not terrible. Overall, basically, what you're seeing here is that 2 things. One, the medium lasers are really just the only thing you got to worry about controlling. This can fire the LRM-10s all day and not build up any heat. The second thing that you learn here is that without the medium lasers, the mech really can't be pushed for more damage, right? In the Zeus we saw, you could bring that large laser into play, start to build up some heat at range, and then cool off a little bit and just eke out a little extra damage. You're not going to have that opportunity here with the Whitworth. So when we jump down to the optimized damage benchmark, what we're looking at is an opportunity to basically build up a little bit of heat right around turn 8 at the 6-inch mark. And you can see that blue area spike above the baseline, but then you have to take a turn to cool off. You can see that heat trend line drops and then goes back up again. So it's a little bit of give or take. The Whitworth really isn't built to sustain heavy heat loads. And you can tell by the bar chart, right? Our baseline was 102.7 points of damage across the 12 turns. When we tried to optimize this thing, we only eked out basically another 2.9 points of heat. So really not much going on there for the extra heat load. On the bottom of this screen, you'll see the weapons groupings and at what turn and what range the weapons were fired. And so, you can see in the optimized grouping, that big damage spike, that's where we're alpha striking. We're firing all of our lasers, all of our LRMs, basically hitting with everything. And it's, it's a meaty hit there, especially at 6 inches when your medium lasers are right at medium range. So, okay, so moving on, again, one of the new things we added, we talked about this in the intro, is the lethality index. So, mechs with like a king crab, twin AC-20s, how do we compare that to a mech that has 8 medium lasers, right? Instinctively, the king crab is it's a scarier thing, right? But how do we represent that in a sort of a mathematical or statistical way? So what I did was built another simulator. So this is similar to similar simulation to the defensive analysis, where we pit our mech like the Whitworth against an awesome, right? And the Whitworth basically has to close on the awesome. The awesome keeps shooting it, and we see how long the Whitworth can survive. Well, I flipped that around. Now the Whitworth is approaching a javelin, and the Whitworth is shooting at the javelin, and we're seeing how soon is this javelin going to get killed, right? So we look at a few different things. One, we look at total cumulative kills in this simulation, right? And we run the simulation, by the way, 10,000 times. So we're getting a nice blended number here, where that basically wipes out any outliers or instant head kills and things like that, which they're still factored in. But if it happens 1 out of 10,000 times, it's not going to skew the numbers. So anyway, so the first donut chart you're looking at does look at, for example, how many head kills did you get? How many CT kills did you get? And how many times did this javelin walk away? To be clear, this is the fire javelin with the 4 medium lasers, so there's no chance for ammo hits. It's got 6 tons of armor, and it's got a 6.9 movement profile, so it's always claiming that +3 target mod. So it's not easy to hit, and that was intentional. So the Whitworth did an okay job, right? 35% of the time it killed the javelin. Most of them are CT kills. It gets a head kill here and there, but again, does not have those big punch weapons like PPCs or AC-20s or Gauss rifles to just drill a head off a mech, in like one shot or whatever. So basically, you're going to see a lower percentage of head kills, higher percentage of CT kills. Basically, it's just raining missiles and lasers down. All right, so how does that translate? So on the right-hand side, there's 3 bars. A yellow bar, which represents our damage per hit. So every time we hit, how much damage are we doing? Well, this mech does 4.84. Almost everything is doing 5 damage, right? A cluster of LRMs, a medium laser, they're all 5 damage. The reasons it's below 5 is because you're not always hitting with 5 missiles, right? Sometimes a cluster, sometimes it just entirely misses, right? You're only doing 5 or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1, right? So that's factored in. That's why this number is below that 5 number. But basically, it's hovering around 5. It's nothing to write home about. How many critical hits did this mech generate? So, a mech like a Kintaro with a bunch of SRMs is going to generate more criticals, right? Because you're more likely to hit exposed locations. That's an important metric, so we wanted to capture that. Remember, this doesn't mean you're always going to deal this number. This is just in respect to this benchmark. So in this benchmark, against the Javelin, the Whitworth generated 4 criticals over that 12-turn period, so it's not terrible. And then we looked at time to kill. So you want this number to be smaller. How many turns does it take on average to kill the Javelin? Now, the simulation only runs 12 turns. It didn't kill it 65% of the time. So what we do is we basically trend the amount of kills per turn, all right? And then I fit a trend line to it. Sometimes it's power, sometimes it's exponential, sometimes it's something else. Basically what I'm looking for is the R-squared value that's closest to 1. And R-squared is basically an explanation of, how well does this line fit all the different data points that you have, right? So the closer to 1, the better. And so we're looking for the highest and the best fit. And then we trend that line out until we hit 10,000 kills. Remember, it's 10,000 simulations. How long to 10,000 kills? We get a number. So this mech, it took 15.5 turns to kill the mech. So on average, most games, you're not going to kill the Javelin. Sometimes you will. 35% of the time you will. But most of the time, it's going to take you about 15.5 turns to kill the Javelin for this mech. So not great, right? This mech puts out a decent amount of damage for a 40-ton mech, in my opinion, but it's not like a stone cold killer, right? This is the kind of mech you're going to use to support other mechs, weaken your target. It's not a mech that's going to go in for the kill shot. On the very bottom, basically, this is just a trend over time. It shows the kills, cumulative kills, turn over turn, motive hits, things like that. That's all factored in, right? If you get a leg hit on the Jenner and you knock out the hip actuator or the leg actuator, it's going to slow the mech down, make it easier to hit. So all that stuff goes into the simulation. So this is just sort of a visualization showing those cumulative effects over time. And you can see there's a big spike at 6 inches, and that corresponds to the Whitworth's alpha strike, right? So at that 6-inch mark, that's where our optimized damage spikes up, and you can see that pays dividends, right? That's a good return on investment. But then it kind of flattens out as you cool off, and then it sort of ramps up again as you get closer. In the backfield, the first 5 turns, really not generating any kills. Again, you're just dealing 5 points here, a couple points there, right, with those missiles. They'll wear the javelin down eventually, but again, 15.5 turns average time to kill. So hopefully that made sense. I spent a little more time on this just to explain it to you, but basically that is the lethality index. So let's move on to our defensive side. Okay, so defensive benchmarks. So this really has not changed at all since the pilot episode with the Zeus. What we're looking at first and foremost over the top, it's a bar chart representing our target mod versus MP penalties. So this mech at full MP can claim a +2 target mod, and that sustains all the way until you're at an MP -4, where you can't claim anything at all. So this is a pretty standard 4/6 mech. Those target mods, obviously. 4/6 is really good because you can move and turn, in my opinion. You can go uphill, go downhill. You can suffer a 5-point heat movement penalty. You can still claim that +2. So, it gives you a little bit of flexibility. Not a ton, but that +2 mod obviously really is critical for the survivability of these mechs. Once you get the +1, it's not so great. But anyway, how's this mech hold up? So this benchmark, just a recap, right? It moves through the prescribed ranges, turn over turn. There's an awesome on the other end firing down at this mech. The awesome is running. I believe it's got a gunnery of 2. And so, it's trying to close the gap and basically get to you as quickly as possible. So how did the Whitworth do? Well, it only survived 17.4% of the time. So 82.6% of the time, this mech did not survive the 12 turns, which, hey, it's a 40-ton mech. It's half the size of the Awesome. It's actually not that bad, and I think that's attributable to its overwhelming amount of armor for this size mech. I mean, 8 tons is a lot of armor on a 40-ton mech. Ammo kills were only at 20%, and I say only because it's packing 2 ammo bins in 2 separate locations. That's pretty good. And the reason I think that it's so low, relatively speaking, is because if you look at the record sheet, it's got basically 5 packed critical slots. One of them is the ammo. So that means there's only a 20% chance that you're going to hit the ammo when you penetrate through those side torsos and into the internal structure. On the motive hit side, 33% cumulative motive hits. That's, really nothing too crazy there. If you look at the trend chart on the right, you can see basically once you get within 6 inches, which is short range for those PPCs, everything, deaths, motive, everything, begins to spike at that point. So this mech is actually pretty tough. As long as it can stay mobile and stay at range, it has pretty decent survivability. Once it gets too close, survivability tanks. And I mean, once you're at point blank range, this thing just crumples. So interesting. Now in the center, one thing I want to bring to mind here, those yellow bars, right? Those represent our expected armor target, right? The green bars represent what the mech actually has in that location. One thing that jumped out at me was, again, side torsos under armor. This is like, we're like 2 for 2 on this. I don't understand it. I would absolutely peel armor off the arms if I were going to mod this mech, and I would put it into the side torsos. I think what you would see there is a drop, potentially even more so, in the ammo kills. You'd also see less transferring in to the CT, or at least you would slow that transfer down. So I think that would increase the survivability of this mech. I would peel off the legs, I would peel off the arms, and I would definitely peel off the back, and I would put it into the front CT and those side CTs. And the reason I take it off the back is because this mech is supposed to be at range. And we'll dive into that a little bit more when we get into the role analysis. But actually, this mech has way too much armor on the back, I think, for what it's used for. But overall, I think defensively for a 40-ton mech, it's not too bad. Pretty solid performance there for this mech. About what you would expect. But again, don't expect it to survive very long at point blank range. Okay, so let's dive into the efficiency. Okay, so when we look at the mech's efficiency, we're looking at basically 2 things here. We're going to look at the effectiveness of the mech, or that is to say, how much damage it can actually bring to bear in conjunction with its survivability. And we're going to look at its sensitivity to gunnery, which is a new thing we talked about in the intro. So we'll dive into that as well. So first, the effectiveness benchmark. So The white line represents the survivability curve. So as you can see, we talked about this in the defensive analysis. Basically, as that mech gets closer, there's just a breaking point where the survivability plummets, and its cumulative survivability ends up around 17.5%. The optimized ACD is the same damage curve that we saw in our offensive benchmark. So the effective ACD, therefore, is a combination or multiplication of the optimized ACD, the optimized average calculated damage at a given turn, times the survivability at that turn, and you get your effective number. So basically, as the survivability drops, you can see those two area charts start to pull away from each other because, again, for example, if you have 20 points of damage on your optimized curve at like a given turn and your survivability is 50%, then your effective damage is only 10, because half the time at that turn you're dead, right? So that's kind of how we do that, and that gives you sort of a blended number of how effective this mech is with respect to both its damage output and its ability to survive over time. So when we look at the metrics here in the bottom of your screen, just to recap, the baseline output was 102.7, the optimized output 105.6, our effective output is 69.6. So that's over 30% drop from the optimized to the effective. But what does that mean in the context of the battle value, right? Because we're paying a price for this mech. Is it good? Is it not? How efficient is this mech in terms of its cost? So we take that effective number, because again, that effective number takes your offensive output, your damage output, your defensive, your armor, your heat sinks, speed, everything's rolled into this effective ACD, and those simulations, all of those variables come into play, which is all the stuff that's baked into your battle value. So we take that effective number and we divide it by your battle value. So we're looking at the effective damage per 100 BV. And what we get here is a score of 5.06. So that it's not bad. It's a little bit above average. Some of the weakest mechs are, in the decimals, like your Charger with the 5 small lasers, Locust with a couple of machine guns and a laser. They don't do a whole lot of damage for what you get, right? And some of the outliers on the other side of the spectrum, like the Annihilator 1E with the 4 PPCs and the Longbow, these guys do tremendous amounts of damage and survive ridiculously long and have very low battle values for some reason. And so, they'll have very high efficiency scores. But when we look at the bell curve, basically around 5 is where you're at. So 5.06, a little bit above average, not looking too shabby. Let's talk about gunnery score sensitivity. So this is new, and I talked about this in the intro as well. So on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you're looking at gunnery score sensitivity. So there's 3 different plots here. The first one in the upper left shows the efficiency score at different gunnery levels. So gunnery 4, gunnery 3, gunnery 2, gunnery 1, gunnery 0. What the efficiency score would be at those given gunneries. And then I sort of plotted a linear trend line, like just kind of like, hey, what's the what would we expect here? Where are we above average? Where are we below the expected average? And what you can see here is that gunnery 2 and gunnery 1 definitely give you the most bang for your buck. They're going to be a little bit above average. If you look at the ACD by gunnery chart on the top right, and you can see these bars, what you learn is that you're getting the most ACD, right, out of those incremental increases than you are otherwise, right? So for example, to go from gunnery 4 to gunnery 3, it's like a 16-point ACD difference, but you're still spending 20%, on the base battle value to get there. To go from like a gunnery 2 gunnery 3 to a gunnery 2, it's an increase of 19 points, right? So you're getting a little bit more bang for your buck there. And so on and so forth, right? And so that's what, again, these two things in conjunction kind of tell you where you're getting a little bit more bang for your buck. Now, regardless, you're always seeing an uptick, at least for this mech, you're always seeing an uptick in efficiency. So overall, yes, gunnery 0 is going to give you a higher efficiency on this mech. But in terms of like, where do I think the breaking point is? I would say gunnery 2, gunnery 1 for this mech is really where you're going to get the most out of it. The bottom chart shows you, it's pretty interesting. It's a little bit much to wrap your head around, but basically these are different effective ACD plots by gunnery. So the lightest being gunnery 4, the darkest being gunnery 0. So for example, you can kind of see gunnery 0 obviously doing a ton more damage than gunnery 4 over the course of the 12-turn simulation. But what's interesting is, where these plots, get a little closer or get a little further away, and it kind of shows you, if I play, for example, a gunnery 0 mech, it's best for me really to keep them outside of, basically 9 inches and beyond, right? Because you can see after 9 inches on gunnery 0, which is the darkest plot, the damage actually almost is identical to gunnery 1. And then as you get, within 5 inches, you're barely getting any benefit over even gunnery 0, right? And that's because of the differential in, your 2d6 probability curve, the difference between a +4 at long range and a +0 at short range, how much are you actually getting on average, your return here. You're going to see more typically at long range, but, not always, right? In some of these scenarios where minimum range comes into play and all these other things and survivability is baked in, it really presents an interesting view of where you're getting the most, again, bang for buck. That's the best way I can say it. And, when I look at this, what it shows me, gunnery 2, gunnery 1, really, to me, is where you're getting the most bang for buck for this mech. All right, so that's efficiency. All right, so this is the last screen here. We're going to dive into the roles. What we're going to look at is some of the key metrics from throughout this analysis, and we're going to score the mech. We're going to take a look at what combat roles I think it would play on the battlefield best, and then we're also going to look at some expanded threat assessment and analyses on the mech. But let's start though with key statistics, shall we? So just to recap, our optimized ACD 105.6. It does 4.84 damage per hit on average. Survived in our benchmark 17.4% of the time. In our red line analysis, it had a 135 heat buildup. So again, that's your heat additive over 12 turns when we did that red line damage simulation. Movement profile of 464, so not very fast, but the gem capabilities do help. Its effective ACD, which is the survival and the optimized ACD, 69.1. And then the efficiency is 5.06. So how does that all shake out and score? Well, offensively, we gave this mech a 3 out of 5. And that's based on a range that we basically saw from both, the worst mechs in the game, where, you're basically a locust with machine guns and a charger with 5 small lasers, all the way up to your most lethal mechs like a longbow or an annihilator 1E with the 4 PPCs. Same thing on the defensive side. We looked at some of the toughest mechs and some of the weakest mechs. So we did this across the board, and we came up with these scoring gradients. So offensively, again, 3.0. Defensively, this mech scored 1.5 out of 5. Now, again, it's very tough for a 40-ton mech. It still dies a lot, right? So you're still going to have to be careful with this mech. That's what this score means. It will survive much better at range. If you can keep it protected in the backfield, it's going to return dividends. But if not, it's going to be just an average mech for you. Control, so very easy to manage the heat on this mech, I think. Average, unless you're, just firing everything all the time, it's pretty average to maintain the heat. It probably could benefit from another heat sink or two, but, it is what it is. Mobility-wise, it's a little bit below average. I mean, 4.6, again, it's not great. Would be nice if it could claim a +3 movement mod, but it can't. It still has jump jets, so that helps. So there it is. And then efficiency, again, with that 5.06 score, it's right around a 3.0. So, not terrible there. All right, let's take a look at the threat assessments. These threat assessments will basically give us some information to basically help us understand where this mech is effective on the battlefield. So this is not a simulation. This is not looking at turnover turn heat or what weapons groupings are most optimum. It doesn't do any of that. This is just straight math. The dark red area represents our alpha strike capability. So if I did max damage with everything, when I pull the trigger and I fire everything, what's my damage? Right, so this mech 2 LRM-10s, at 21 inches, it could do up to 20 damage, right? So that's basically the dark red. The light red is taking that and then doing our average damage calculation, right? So figuring out what's the 2-hit number, what's our gator basically, what's our target number, multiplying that by the damage per weapon, and then blending that all together. And, what you get is basically a different number, right, which is substantially lower. This is what you're going to do on average, over N turns at this particular range with these weapons, right? So that shows you basically damage capability, or maximum possible damage that we could do with an Alpha Strike, and then the damage that, on average you're going to do over the course of, again, a series of games at that particular range. So I wanted to come up with a metric that shows the ratio of the maximum possible damage to the damage you're probably going to do, right? But then also factor in heat, because heat is sort of the currency for damage, right? If I can sit there and I can do 20 points of damage and build up no heat, that's pretty great. But PPCs do 10 points of heat, right? And you're building up 20 points of heat for 20 points of damage. So that's not as great, right? It's what makes medium lasers so good. You get 5 points of damage, 3 heat, but there's a range issue there. So all of this stuff had to be factored in. So I basically took the ratio of maximum damage to your average damage, right? That's factoring in the range of the weapon. And then I also basically factored in how much heat are you building up, and I created a threat ratio. And so what you can see here is that this threat ratio sort of maps to the maximum average calculated damage, except that we're also looking at heat. So as those medium lasers come into play, right, within 9 inches, you can see that damage starts to climb up, and then it drops off as the LRMs are in minimum range. But it's lower than the threat ratio at 14 to 10 inches, right? Because at 14 to 10 inches, your LRMs are in medium range. You are doing a ton of average damage. You also have a big, chance for a 20-point hit, and you're not building up any heat, right? So this mech really operates very well in that 14 to 10 inch range, and that's what that yellow threat ratio line kind of shows us. So pretty interesting look at the threat assessment there. And then on the right, we have the threat envelope. So again, brainchild of Tom here. And what he really wanted to capture was, some mechs can arm flip, right? Some mechs have rear-mounted weapons. Some mechs have more on their arms or less on their arms. Being able to, swing around and shoot out the back, it's an important thing. It's a big part of the game. Where you can bring your weapons to bear is just as important as how much damage they do. And so this threat envelope is a visualization to represent that. And so what you can see here is on the Whitworth, it's got a couple of arm-mounted lasers, so it has some, some shorter range ability in those rear left and rear right arcs, not too much. And then in the front is really where it's doing the most damage. It's got, the twin LRM-10s overlapping, and then once you get in the front arc, you've got 3 medium lasers you can bring in on top of that. So, that's a pretty, if you hit 35 points of damage, that's a pretty nasty, that's a pretty brutal Alpha Strike. You can puncture, some bigger mechs with that kind of damage. So overall, the mech does have some very scary capabilities. You just have to keep it alive, and in my opinion, you have to keep it at range. Those medium lasers really should be like a last ditch or a cleanup type tool. So that brings us to combat roles, the last part of this mech review. Exciting. So where would this mech play on the field? You all guessed it, fire support, right? This is where I played it in the battle report against Kevin. I just sat it at that, I'd have to go back to the footage and look, but I really believe it was in that, 10 to 14 inch range even. And it was just decimating. And really played a great role there. Every now and then I was able to move in, bring those medium lasers into play for a little extra oomph, but really it was just dependent on those LRM-10s for most of the game. So fire support is really where this mech shines. Secondly, I would say second line role. So by second line, I mean sits in the back for the first half of the game, moves in to clean up the trash, bringing those medium lasers into play. Once the big threats have been neutralized. Again, you do not want this mech going toe-to-toe with something like a Wolverine or even like a Commando. I think at point-blank range, your LRMs start to lose their effectiveness. You could be in a bit of trouble there against a dedicated brawling type mech. Lastly, skirmisher. So I hesitate on this one. This is sort of like a stretch. I think that this mech can play a skirmishing role if it's like the little guy in a heavy lance or an assault lance even. If there are other lights on the field, you do not want this mech on a flank by itself, because something like a Wolfhound will run this mech down, right? This mech is slow, right? 4/6. Something fast will run this mech down and just eat it alive. It just, even with all the armor, it just doesn't have, as we saw in the survivability, it just doesn't have that sustainability at close range to really be, I think, in my opinion, threatening enough. Because it, again, it's not just, you might think, oh, well, Wolfhound's got 3 mediums, this has 3 mediums, they have similar armor, but the Wolfhound's packing a much higher movement mod. The Wolfhound is, and again, this is a theoretical matchup, but, mechs like that, they're just faster. And that's where this mech's survivability really suffers in its speed. So that's why, again, I hesitate on the skirmisher role. I think the optimum placement for this mech is in the backfield, where its flanks are protected, its front is protected, and it can just really just rain in some death. For example, when I played it in that recon mission with Kevin, he didn't go after it because he had to focus on the other mechs, right? The mech's going for the objective. So, when you're playing objective-based games, keeping this mech in a position where, it might not be as juicy of a target, but can still really, lay in some hurt. So, I hope that made sense. It was fun. Definitely some really cool new stuff in here for you guys to chew on. Thanks again for all the feedback. I think this makes sense to me. Would be interesting to hear what you guys think of this review, and also tell me what you think of the Whitworth. I was reading on Sarna last night, man. I think get some bad press from the houses. Karuta has some nasty nicknames for this mech, but I love it. So would be interested to hear what you guys think as well. But that said, we're all wrapped up. So guys, thank you so much again. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more from Death from Above Wargaming.